Have you ever driven down a road so desolate, so utterly removed from civilization, that you felt as if you were crossing into another world? A place where the air itself grows heavy, and the darkness seems to breathe? That's exactly what happened to Eduardo Vasconcelos and his friends on what should have been an ordinary road trip. Eduardo, a landscape photographer obsessed with capturing the unknown, had dragged his small group of friends off the beaten path in search of a hidden gem he had read about online. But what they found was not on any map, nor did it belong to any world they understood. The group had been traveling for hours, guided by Eduardo's unrelenting curiosity and an outdated GPS. The road narrowed, flanked by dense, skeletal trees whose branches clawed at the sky like the fingers of the dead. The car's headlights struggled to pierce the growing darkness, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked asphalt. A low mist began to creep across the road, swallowing the tires and dulling the sound of their laughter, which had already grown uneasy. The radio emitted only static, a faint whispering buried beneath it that no one dared to acknowledge. "Are we even still in the same state?" one of them joked, their voice tinged with an edge of fear. As the group drove deeper, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, each curve pulling them further from the familiarity of the world they knew. Then, without warning, the GPS blinked out entirely, the screen flashing a single word: stop. At that moment, the headlights caught a sign, rusted and barely legible, that read, Nova Esperança, 5 kilometers. The name sent an inexplicable chill through Eduardo. There was no mention of such a place in his research, yet something about it felt oddly familiar, as though he had dreamed it before. Against their better judgment, they followed the sign, curiosity outweighing the gnawing dread in their stomachs. The first glimpse of Nova Esperança was like stepping into a photograph from a forgotten era. Cobblestone streets lined with crooked houses stood beneath a moonlit sky veiled in clouds. The buildings, though seemingly abandoned, appeared meticulously preserved, their windows intact but eerily dark. A grand church loomed at the center of a sprawling square, its towering spire piercing the heavens like a jagged blade. The group parked the car at the town's edge, their unease deepening as they stepped out into the unnaturally cold air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant toll of a bell, deep, resonant, and impossibly slow. "Do you hear that?" one of them whispered, their voice barely audible over the sound of their own breath. Eduardo clutched his camera tightly, snapping pictures of the empty streets. But as he reviewed the shots, his hands trembled. In every photo, there was movement, blurs of shadowy figures that hadn't been there before. Before diving deeper into this haunting tale, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. You wouldn't want to miss the next chapter of this journey into the unknown. The air in Nova Esperança was wrong. It clung to Eduardo and his friends like a damp shroud, heavy with a metallic tang that stung their noses and left a bitter taste on their tongues. The group tried to shake off the unease as they wandered through the eerily perfect streets, but every step they took deepened the sensation that they were being watched. Eduardo, ever the explorer, raised his camera to document the uncanny beauty of the deserted town. He framed a shot of the grand church in the distance, its steeple framed by the swirling fog. But when he clicked the shutter, a strange sound broke the silence, a faint, echoing whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What was that? Sophia, one of Eduardo's closest friends, froze mid-step. The others exchanged nervous glances, straining their ears for another sound. The whisper came again, louder this time, a fractured murmur of unintelligible words that seemed to dance on the edge of comprehension. Eduardo glanced at his camera screen to review the photo he had just taken. The image showed the church as expected, but there was something else. A faint figure standing in the doorway, its outline blurred as if it were in motion. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He didn't tell the others. Not yet. Instead, he tried to focus on the strange sensations around him. The cobblestones beneath their feet felt oddly warm despite the chilling air, and the mist seemed to react to their movements, curling and twisting as though alive. Sophia grabbed Eduardo's arm suddenly, her grip tight enough to hurt. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a street corner. A shadow moved there, deliberate, slow, before vanishing behind a building. The group hesitated. Eduardo's friend Lucas forced a nervous laugh. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, though his voice trembled. But deep down, they all knew better. Something about this place defied logic. It felt like stepping into a dream that was too vivid, too real, to be mere imagination. The smells were sharp and unsettling, the faint aroma of burning wood, the acrid sting of something metallic, and the unmistakable scent of decay that lingered in the corners of their consciousness. As they wandered further, they came across a small shop with its door slightly ajar. The sign above it, hanging by a single rusted chain, read General Goods. It swayed gently in the non-existent breeze. Eduardo's curiosity pushed him forward, his camera ready. The door creaked open with agonizing slowness, revealing a room frozen in time. Shelves lined with dusty jars and cans stood untouched, and a single oil lamp flickered on the counter, its flame impossibly steady. But then they noticed the most unsettling detail. There were footprints in the thick layer of dust on the floor, bare feet, small and childlike. They led deeper into the shop, disappearing into the shadows at the back. "We shouldn't be here," murmured Anna, another friend. Her voice wavered, and she clutched at Lucas's arm, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Eduardo stepped forward despite her protest, his heart pounding in his ears. He followed the footprints to the back of the shop, where he found a door slightly ajar. As he pushed it open, a wave of cold air rushed past him, carrying with it the sound of faint laughter, high-pitched, childlike, and utterly chilling. The room beyond was empty, save for a single wooden rocking horse that swayed gently back and forth, creaking rhythmically. His friends called out for him, their voices strained with fear, but Eduardo couldn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the rocking horse. In that moment, he swore he saw a small figure reflected in the cracked mirror on the wall, just for a second, before the glass shattered with a deafening crash. He stumbled back, his friends rushing to his side. "We need to leave," Sophia said, her voice urgent. "Now." Eduardo nodded, but as they turned to exit the shop, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The oil lamp flickered and went out, plunging them into suffocating darkness. And in that black void, the whispers returned, louder, clearer, and now unmistakably speaking their names. The air inside the shop grew impossibly cold, biting at their skin as if the very walls were exhaling frost. Eduardo's breath fogged in front of him, each exhalation shallow and rapid. The whispers now filled the room, weaving an oppressive tapestry of sound. They weren't just words, they were accusations, pleas, and cries of anguish. Some voices seemed familiar, others foreign, but all carried the weight of despair. The group huddled together in the dark, their flashlights shaking as beams of light darted across the room, illuminating only the choking dust and fragments of the shattered mirror. Lucas took a hesitant step toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. But the moment he touched it, a searing pain shot through his arm, and he cried out. He stumbled back, clutching his hand, which now bore a dark, blistering mark in the shape of a handprint. "It's like something's keeping us in here," he gasped, his voice cracking. The whispers swelled in response, growing louder and more frantic, as if the room itself were alive and furious. Eduardo's camera, still clutched tightly in his hands, suddenly turned on by itself. The screen flickered, displaying static before an image began to form. It was the shop, but not as they saw it now. The shelves were fully stocked, the counter pristine, and a woman stood behind it, her face obscured by the veil of static. She seemed to be staring directly into the camera, her head tilting unnaturally to one side. Then the screen went dark again, leaving only Eduardo's reflection staring back at him. Except, it wasn't his reflection. The figure in the screen smirked, a cruel, knowing expression, and raised a finger to its lips in a shushing gesture. Eduardo's stomach twisted, and he nearly dropped the camera. "We're not alone here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His friends didn't need convincing. The oppressive presence was undeniable now, a suffocating force pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. From the back room, the rocking horse began to creak again, swaying with a rhythmic motion that matched the cadence of the whispers. The sound grew louder and louder until it filled the entire shop, drowning out everything else. Anna let out a strangled scream, pointing to the back wall. The dusty footprints they had seen earlier were now wet, leaving behind crimson stains as if the child had been walking through blood. Suddenly, the shop's shelves toppled over, cans and jars crashing to the ground, releasing the smell of something foul, rotten, decayed, and unmistakably human. The group recoiled, gagging as the rancid stench filled the air. Eduardo's flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, the beam illuminated a figure standing in the doorway to the back room. It was a child, no older than 10, wearing a tattered white dress stained with dirt and blood. Her head hung low, her long, matted hair obscuring her face. "Do you see her?" Sophia whispered, her voice trembling with terror. The child lifted her head slowly, revealing hollow eye sockets that seemed to bleed shadows. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a single, deafening voice that roared through the room. "Leave." The lights in the shop burst simultaneously, plunging them back into darkness. Eduardo and his friends stumbled toward the door, their panic overriding the burning pain Lucas had felt earlier. This time, the door gave way, swinging open violently and throwing them onto the cobblestone street outside. They scrambled to their feet, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. But as they turned back to look at the shop, it was gone. The building had vanished without a trace, leaving only an empty plot of land overgrown with weeds. The group stared in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. Eduardo checked his camera again, hoping for some proof of the nightmare they had just escaped. But every photo and video was gone, replaced by static. Except for one image. It was a group photo of them standing in front of the shop, smiling. But there was one more figure in the photo. A child in a tattered dress standing between Eduardo and Sofia, her hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. As the group stood paralyzed, staring at the photo of themselves with the ghostly child, a chilling realization crept over them. They hadn't escaped Nova Esperança. The cobblestone streets stretched endlessly in both directions, the mist growing thicker, as if the town itself was tightening its grip on them. The church bell began to toll again, slow, deliberate, and resonant, as if marking the passage of something far more sinister than time. "We need to get back to the car," Lucas stammered, his voice shaking with desperation. But when they turned to look for it, the car was gone. In its place was an empty stretch of road leading nowhere, swallowed by darkness. The group began to panic, their breaths quickening as the oppressive silence returned. Eduardo felt his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing for an explanation, a way out, anything to ground him in reality. But reality had abandoned them. The church loomed ahead, its silhouette sharper, darker, and more menacing than before. Its doors stood ajar, a faint golden light spilling out and flickering as if inviting them in. "No," Sofia whispered, clutching Eduardo's arm. "We can't go in there." But something, an invisible force, seemed to tug at them, pulling them closer to the church with every passing second. Eduardo, unable to resist the pull, took the first step forward. The air around him felt heavier with each step, as if gravity itself were working against him. The whispers returned, but now they carried a new tone, mocking, taunting, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come here," one voice hissed. "It's too late now," another chuckled. Inside, the church was impossibly vast, far larger than its exterior suggested. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense and decay, a cloying mixture that turned their stomachs. The golden light came from a series of candelabras lining the pews, their flames flickering unnaturally, as if alive. At the center of the altar stood a massive stained glass window, its intricate design depicting scenes of judgment and despair. Figures writhed in agony, their faces twisted in eternal torment, and at the center was the child they had seen earlier, now larger, her hollow eyes watching them from the glass. A sudden crash echoed through the church as the massive doors slammed shut behind them. The group spun around, pounding on the doors, but they wouldn't budge. "Why did you bring us here?" Anna screamed at Eduardo, her voice cracking with terror. But he didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the altar, where a figure now stood. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its face obscured by a hood, but its presence was suffocating. It raised an arm, pointing directly at Eduardo, and the room seemed to pulse with energy. A deep, guttural voice filled the space, reverberating in their bones. "You are not supposed to be here. But now you belong." The ground beneath them began to shift, the cobblestone floor cracking and splintering to reveal something far more horrifying. Beneath the church was a dark abyss, writhing with shadows that seemed to take on shapes. Faces screaming silently, hands clawing upward, desperate to escape. The temperature plummeted, and the golden light from the candles turned a sickly green. Suddenly, Eduardo's camera turned on again, the flash going off repeatedly, blinding them momentarily. When their vision cleared, the pews were no longer empty. Figures, gaunt and translucent, sat silently, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. Some were familiar, faces Eduardo recognized from the photos he had taken before arriving in Nova Esperança. These were the lost souls, trapped between worlds, bound to the town. The child from the photo appeared in the center aisle, walking slowly toward them. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if she were a puppet on invisible strings. "She's coming," Sofia screamed, backing away. But the child raised her hand, and with it, the group froze in place. They couldn't move, couldn't speak, only watch in horror as she stopped in front of Eduardo. "Why are you here?" the child whispered, her voice soft but filled with an otherworldly echo. "What did you seek to find?" Eduardo tried to answer, but his voice was caught in his throat. The child tilted her head, waiting, then placed her hand on his chest. A searing pain shot through him, and his mind filled with flashes of visions. Faces he didn't recognize, places he'd never been, and a sense of crushing guilt he couldn't understand. The hooded figure at the altar raised both arms, and the abyss below began to rise, tendrils of shadow stretching toward the group. Eduardo knew they were out of time. "We have to make a choice," he shouted, his voice finally breaking free. The others looked at him in confusion and terror, but before they could respond, the child whispered, "Only one of you can leave." The room erupted into chaos. The shadows surged upward, and the pews shattered as the ghostly figures lunged toward them. Eduardo and his friends fought against the invisible force holding them, but the child's eyes glowed brighter, freezing them in place. The hooded figure laughed, its voice a deep, guttural roar that shook the church. Eduardo's camera flashed one final time, capturing an image of the chaos before the screen cracked, plunging them into absolute darkness. The whispers returned, louder, overlapping in a cacophony of torment. And then silence. When Eduardo opened his eyes, he was alone in the church. The altar was empty, the shadows gone, and the child nowhere to be seen. But the doors were open now, revealing the misty streets of Nova Esperança. In his trembling hands was his camera, the screen displaying a single photo. His friends, trapped in the stained glass window, their faces twisted in silent screams. Eduardo stumbled out of the church, his legs trembling and his chest heaving with every breath. The air outside felt heavier than before, as if the town itself were pressing down on him. The streets were eerily quiet now, the oppressive silence amplifying the sound of his footsteps on the cobblestones. He clutched his camera tightly, unable to stop glancing at the screen where the haunting photo of his friends was still displayed. Their faces, frozen in agony within the stained glass window, seemed to shift slightly whenever he looked away, as though the image was alive. He tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince himself it was all a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But every step he took reminded him of the cold, suffocating reality of Nova Esperança. The whispers still lingered faintly in the air, teasing him, urging him to look back toward the church. But he didn't dare. His only thought was to find the car and escape. As Eduardo wandered the streets, he noticed something strange. The houses he passed seemed to change subtly, their architecture shifting with each glance. Windows that had been broken were now intact, doors that had been closed stood open, and faint lights flickered within as if someone, or something, were inside watching. He tried to ignore the nagging feeling that he was being followed, but every time he turned a corner, the shadow of a figure flickered just out of sight. His breath caught in his throat when he finally saw it. The car, sitting at the edge of the mist-shrouded road. Relief surged through him, and he broke into a sprint, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty town. But as he reached the car, his relief turned to dread. The windows were fogged over from the inside, and the doors were locked. Peering through the windshield, he froze. Sitting in the driver's seat was Lucas, his friend who had disappeared in the church. But Lucas wasn't moving. His head was tilted back, his eyes wide open and glazed over, and his mouth twisted into a silent scream. The same crimson handprint that had burned his skin earlier was now etched across his throat, as though something had grabbed him from the inside. Eduardo stumbled back, his hands trembling. The whispers grew louder again, swirling around him like a storm. In a panic, he opened his camera, desperate for answers. He scrolled through the photos, his stomach churning as he realized they were all changing. Images of empty streets now showed shadowy figures standing in the windows, watching him. Photos of the church depicted new details, strange symbols glowing on the walls, and the hooded figure from the altar staring directly into the lens. Then he found a video. It was one he didn't remember recording, and his finger hovered over the play button, hesitation gripping him. But the whispers grew louder, and something inside him urged him to watch. The video began with static, then flickered to reveal his friends inside the church, standing frozen in place as the child and the hooded figure loomed over them. The child turned to the camera, her hollow eyes piercing through the screen, and whispered, "He chose this. He belongs to us now." Eduardo dropped the camera, his heart racing. His mind reeled as he pieced together what had happened. The choices they had made inside the town, following the signs, entering the shop, stepping into the church, had all been part of a twisted game. Nova Esperança wasn't just a place, it was a liminal space, a trap between the living and the dead, feeding on the curiosity and fears of those who wandered too far. Desperate to escape, Eduardo climbed into the car, avoiding Lucas's lifeless gaze as he slid into the passenger seat. He turned the ignition, and the engine roared to life. But as the car moved forward, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, the mist thickening until it was impossible to see anything beyond the headlights. The whispers grew deafening now, overlapping voices screaming warnings and threats. Just when Eduardo thought he would lose his mind, the mist parted, revealing the outline of a familiar gas station. Relief washed over him as he realized he had returned to the main road. The car sputtered to a stop, and he stumbled out, collapsing onto the pavement. The station attendant approached, his face lined with concern. "Are you all right?" the man asked. Eduardo could barely form words. I was in a town. Nova Esperança. My friends." The attendant's face paled at the mention of the name. "You've been to Nova Esperança?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That place hasn't existed for over 50 years. It burned to the ground, but some say it still finds those who are lost." Eduardo looked back at the car. Lucas's body was gone. The car was empty, its windows spotless, as though no one had ever been inside. His camera, still clutched in his hand, was blank. Every photo, every video gone. But as he turned it off, the screen flickered one last time, showing the stained glass window from the church. His own face stared back at him from within the glass, trapped alongside his friends. The attendant took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "You need to leave." "Now," he said. Eduardo nodded, climbing back into the car and driving away. But no matter how far he went, the whispers never truly left him. And every time he looked into a reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even water, he swore he could see Nova Esperança waiting, watching, and calling him back. Days turned into weeks, but Eduardo couldn't shake the feeling that Nova Esperança hadn't let him go. No matter how far he drove, no matter how many towns or cities he passed through, something dark clung to him like a shadow. His dreams were no longer his own. Each night, he found himself walking those cobblestone streets, hearing the whispers, seeing glimpses of his friends trapped within the church's stained glass window. The line between waking and dreaming began to blur, and Eduardo felt himself spiraling into despair. The real world offered no solace. The photos on his camera had vanished, but his reflection in mirrors told a different story. Whenever he caught his own image, it wasn't him staring back. It was his likeness as it appeared in the stained glass window, hollow-eyed, desperate, and bound. Terrified, he avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces altogether, but the reflections found him anyway. Pools of water on the street, the sheen of polished furniture, even the glint of a stranger's sunglasses, all of them revealed his twisted reflection, staring, waiting. Desperate for answers, Eduardo began researching Nova Esperança. He spent long hours combing through old newspaper archives, local legends, and whispered rumors passed down in small towns. Most accounts were vague: a cursed town, destroyed in a fire decades ago, where those who entered were never seen again. But one article stood out. It detailed the story of a priest who had lived in Nova Esperança before the fire. The priest was accused of heresy for performing forbidden rituals to bridge the worlds of the living and the dead. His last recorded words, scrawled hastily in the margins of a burnt journal, sent chills down Eduardo's spine. "Only the chosen may leave. The rest are claimed." Eduardo wasn't alone in his search. During one of his visits to a remote library, he met an elderly woman named Dona Clara, a folklorist who had spent her life collecting stories of the supernatural. Her eyes narrowed when he mentioned Nova Esperança. "You went there, didn't you?" she asked, her voice heavy with dread. Eduardo nodded, his throat dry. "I saw my friends, they're still there. I need to save them." Clara shook her head. "No one is saved from Nova Esperança. But if the town let you leave, it means you owe it something. And it will come to collect." Clara handed Eduardo an ancient-looking map, the edges brittle and yellowed with age. The map depicted Nova Esperança in intricate detail, far more detailed than anything Eduardo had seen before. Marked on it were symbols and cryptic notes written in a language he couldn't decipher. "This is a guide to the town's heart," Clara explained. "If your friends are still there, they're trapped in the veil. The town thrives on souls, but there's a way to disrupt its hold. You must confront its guardian." The guardian. Eduardo's mind flashed back to the hooded figure in the church, the one whose mere presence had suffocated him with dread. He wasn't sure if he could face it again, but the image of his friends, their faces twisted in silent agony, drove him forward. Armed with the map, he retraced his steps, following the same desolate road that had led him to Nova Esperança the first time. The town greeted him like an old enemy. The cobblestone streets were as he remembered, but now they pulsed faintly with a dim, sickly light, as if the town itself were alive. The whispers returned, louder this time, speaking directly into his mind. "Why have you come back?" they demanded, overlapping and chaotic. Eduardo pressed forward, clutching the map tightly as it seemed to guide his steps. The journey through the town was far more harrowing than before. The shadows were no longer content to linger in the periphery. They reached out toward him, clawing at his clothes, pulling at his arms. The air grew colder with each step, and the buildings around him seemed to shift and warp, their walls bending inward as if trying to trap him. Eduardo reached the church once more, its doors wide open as if waiting for him. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, and the pews were occupied again by the ghostly figures he had seen in his photos. Their eyes followed him as he walked down the aisle, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. The altar had changed. Where the stained glass window once stood, there was now a swirling void, a gaping maw of shadow and light. Standing before it was the child, her hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice layered with the voices of countless others. "You had your chance to leave. Now you must choose again." Behind her, the hooded figure emerged from the shadows, its form even more monstrous than Eduardo remembered. Its cloak seemed to writhe like a living thing, and its face was still obscured, but its presence was suffocating. It raised a hand, and the floor beneath Eduardo cracked, revealing the abyss once more. The tendrils of shadow reached out toward him, and Eduardo felt the weight of the town's malevolence bearing down on him. He unfolded the map, desperate for guidance. The cryptic symbols began to glow faintly, and one phrase burned itself into his mind. The heart must be severed to free the bound. Eduardo realized what he had to do. The Guardian wasn't just a figure to confront. It was the town's anchor to this world. Destroying it might release its hold, but the price was unclear. Eduardo stepped forward, his heart pounding. The whispers screamed in protest, the shadows pulling at his legs, trying to drag him into the abyss. But he pressed on, his eyes locked on the Guardian. As he approached, the hooded figure lowered its hand and spoke for the first time, its voice echoing with unimaginable power. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand. Do you think you are free, Eduardo? You have always belonged to us." The words struck Eduardo like a physical blow, but he refused to falter. With trembling hands, he raised his camera, its lens cracked and barely functional. The flash went off, and for a brief moment, the room was bathed in blinding light. When the light faded, the Guardian's form flickered, its cloak unraveling like smoke. The child screamed, her voice splitting the air, and the void behind her began to collapse. But as the shadows retreated, Eduardo felt a cold hand close around his wrist. The child's hollow eyes burned into his soul, and her voice, now soft and sorrowful, whispered, "You can't save them without losing yourself." Eduardo's pulse pounded in his ears as the child's hand tightened around his wrist. Her hollow eyes glowed brighter, their light revealing shapes swirling in the collapsing void behind her. Faces, twisted and agonized, reaching out as if clawing for salvation. Among them, Eduardo saw Lucas, Anna, and Sofia, their mouths moving as if screaming, though no sound emerged. He wanted to pull away, to run, but her grip was unbreakable. "You came back for them," the child whispered, her voice impossibly layered with the screams of countless souls. "But do you know the cost?" The hooded Guardian loomed behind her, its form flickering like a dying flame, yet its presence was no less suffocating. Its cloak unraveled further, revealing an inhuman shape beneath, a tangle of shadows and limbs that seemed to twist in impossible directions. "I'll do whatever it takes," Eduardo said, his voice trembling but resolute. His camera hung at his side, the strap cutting into his shoulder as though it carried the weight of the entire town. The whispers around him grew louder, taunting him with fragments of his own thoughts. "You can't save them. You can't even save yourself." The child tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Then choose," she said, stepping aside to reveal the swirling abyss behind her. From its depths rose two paths, each one glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light. One path shimmered with a golden hue, warm and inviting, but its surface writhed as though alive. The other was cold and dark, its stones cracked and uneven, exuding an icy mist that chilled Eduardo to the bone even from a distance. "The golden path leads to freedom," the child said, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You may leave this place and never look back. But your friends will remain here, bound to the veil, their souls feeding the town for eternity." She gestured to the darker path. "The shadowed way leads to the heart of Nova Esperança. Confront it, and you may release them. But the veil does not let go without claiming something in return." Eduardo's mind raced. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, each voice pulling him in a different direction. He glanced at the golden path, so deceptively welcoming, and felt the temptation to escape. His body ached with exhaustion, his spirit drained by the relentless fear. But when his gaze shifted to the darker path, the image of his friends, trapped, screaming silently in the stained glass window, flashed before his eyes. "I can't leave them," he said finally, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. The child smiled faintly, her expression both approving and sorrowful. "Very well," she said, stepping aside. "But know this, the heart is not easily severed. The veil demands pain, sacrifice, and truth. If you falter, it will take everything." As Eduardo stepped onto the darker path, the air around him grew heavier, pressing against his chest like a vice. Each step felt like a battle, the stones beneath his feet burning cold as frost began to creep up his legs. The path twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the abyss, where the faint glow of the outside world disappeared entirely. Shadows danced on the edges of his vision, their shapes shifting and writhing, but whenever he turned to face them, they vanished. The whispers grew louder, but now they spoke directly to him, their words cutting deep into his psyche. "You abandoned them. You should have stayed away. This is your fault." Eduardo clenched his fists, refusing to give in, but the voices struck with surgical precision, dredging up memories he had tried to forget. Times he had failed his friends, moments of selfishness and cowardice. Finally, the path ended at a vast, open chamber. At its center stood the heart of Nova Esperança, a grotesque, pulsating mass of shadow and light that seemed to breathe. It was both alive and not, its surface shifting constantly as if faces were trying to emerge from within. The hooded figure reappeared, standing before the heart, its cloak now fully dissolved to reveal its true form. A monstrous entity of tangled limbs and screaming faces, its body composed of the very souls the veil had claimed. "This is your final chance," the figure boomed, its voice shaking the ground beneath Eduardo's feet. "Turn back now, and you may live. Step forward, and you will face the veil's wrath." Eduardo didn't hesitate. He raised his camera, its cracked lens glowing faintly, as if responding to the heart's energy. The hooded figure lunged at him, its limbs stretching impossibly far, but Eduardo dodged, snapping a photo as he did. The flash illuminated the chamber, and the figure recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. The heart began to pulse faster, its surface rippling as the faces within screamed silently. Eduardo felt a searing pain in his chest, as though his very soul were being torn apart. But he pressed on, stepping closer to the heart despite the agony. With trembling hands, he raised the camera once more, the whispers now deafening, and took another photo. The flash exploded with a blinding light, and the heart let out an otherworldly shriek. The ground beneath Eduardo cracked and splintered, and the shadows around him writhed in agony. The hooded figure dissolved into the air, its monstrous form disintegrating as the veil's grip began to weaken. But as the heart collapsed, Eduardo felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the child, her hollow eyes now filled with tears. "You've severed the veil," she said softly, "but it still demands a price." Before Eduardo could react, the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell into the darkness. The last thing he saw was the faint glow of his camera, still clutched in his hands, as the shadows swallowed him whole. The world around Eduardo was nothing but darkness. A suffocating void pressed against him, swallowing every sound, every breath, every thought. He felt as if he were falling endlessly, his body weightless but heavy with the knowledge of what had just occurred. The last image burned into his mind was the child's sorrowful eyes and the crumbling heart of Nova Esperança, its screams reverberating in his ears like a distant storm. Then suddenly he awoke. The ground beneath him was cold and rough, the smell of damp earth and decay filling his nostrils. Eduardo opened his eyes to find himself lying in the middle of a desolate road, the faint light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The air was eerily still, and the oppressive weight that had clung to him in Nova Esperança seemed to have lifted. For a moment, he dared to believe he had escaped. But as he sat up, his heart sank. His camera was still in his hands, its cracked lens reflecting the faint glow of the rising sun. The screen was dark, but when he pressed the power button, it flickered to life, displaying a single image: the church in Nova Esperança. The stained glass window was shattered, its fragments scattered across the ground, but the faces of his friends were gone. "Did I save them?" Eduardo whispered to himself, his voice trembling. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. He looked around, searching for any sign of where he was, but the road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by the same skeletal trees that had led him to the cursed town in the first place. As he stood, he noticed something strange. The faint outline of a figure appeared in the distance, standing motionless at the edge of the road. Eduardo squinted, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was familiar, too familiar. It was Lucas. His friend stood there, his body rigid, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Lucas?" Eduardo called, but the figure didn't respond. Eduardo's pulse quickened as he approached, but with every step, Lucas seemed to grow farther away, his form flickering like a mirage. "Lucas, wait!" Eduardo shouted, breaking into a run. The road beneath his feet felt like it was shifting, pulling him backward even as he pushed forward. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, their tone mocking and cruel. "You think it's over?" a voice hissed in his ear. Eduardo spun around, but there was no one there. When he turned back toward Lucas, the figure was gone. In its place stood the child, her hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She tilted her head, the corners of her mouth curling into a faint, eerie smile. "You severed the veil," she said, her voice echoing like distant thunder. "But its mark remains. You carry it now." Eduardo stepped back, shaking his head. "No, I destroyed it. I freed them," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. The child's smile widened, but there was no malice in it, only a quiet, knowing sorrow. "Did you?" she asked simply. With a wave of her hand, the road around Eduardo began to dissolve, replaced by the familiar cobblestone streets of Nova Esperança. The town stood as it always had, its buildings frozen in time, the air heavy with mist and whispers. The church loomed in the distance, its steeple piercing the sky like a jagged blade. "No," Eduardo whispered, stumbling backward. "I escaped. This isn't real." But the child stepped closer, her presence cold and unrelenting. "Nova Esperança isn't a place," she said. "It's a choice, a promise. And you belong to it now." The camera in Eduardo's hands grew hot, and he dropped it with a cry. When it hit the ground, the screen flickered to life once more, displaying a live feed of the town square. The image zoomed in on the church, where the stained glass window had been restored. But now it was different. Eduardo's face stared back at him from the center, twisted in silent agony. His heart pounded as he turned toward the church. The doors stood open, and faint music drifted from within, a haunting, mournful melody that seemed to pull him closer. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, their words indistinguishable but their intent clear. Eduardo took a step forward, his legs moving as if against his will. As he crossed the threshold of the church, the doors slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Eduardo turned, pounding on the doors, but they wouldn't budge. He screamed for help, but no sound escaped his lips. The child stood nearby, watching silently, her expression unreadable. She turned toward the road, where the mist began to roll in, obscuring the town from view. Eduardo's story ends here, or does it? Nova Esperança remains, waiting for its next visitor, its whispers calling to the lost, the curious, and the desperate. Did Eduardo truly escape, or was his return inevitable? What is the price of curiosity, and how far would you go to save those you love? If you have your own theories about Eduardo's fate or the true nature of Nova Esperança, let us know in the comments. And remember, sometimes the places that call to us are the ones we're never meant to find. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who loves the unknown or fears it.